We recently done a video on building desktop applications with PyQt, and that should be appearing on the screen now. This was a very popular video and there was a lot of requests for a more detailed follow-up, and that's what we're going to do in this video. So we're going to build something slightly more advanced in this video, and we're going to integrate our PyQt application with an SQL database. And we're going to allow users to track a list of items, and also we're going to allow the user to add a new item to the list, and that's all going to show up in the PyQt application, and it's going to be integrated with the database. So let's get started. I've got the documentation for a module in PyQt6, and that's the QtSql module. Now before we go on, someone noted in the previous video that this is actually PyQt rather than PyQt. Now I'm going to just keep pronouncing it PyQt. But if it's actually pronounced PyQt, which does make sense, I guess, then let me know in the comments. But this module here for SQL, this contains classes that integrate with SQL databases. We're going to look at some of these in this video. Now, for example, we have a QSQL database class that you can use to establish a connection with a relational database. And we're also going to look at the QSQL query class, and that allows you to perform an SQL query and get results from the database and bring them into the PyQt application. And it will also allow you to send data to the database. We'll look at some of these and some more later in the video. But let's get started by going to VS Code. I've got this open here. This is a very basic app.py file that contains a Q application object that we're instantiating. And then we are starting the event loop by calling app.exec. Now we covered these concepts in the previous video, so check that out. It's in the description. And what we're going to do now is we're going to actually create a database in the directory that we have this app.py file. Now the database we're going to use, just for simplicity, is going to be SQLite. So we're going to create a database here called todos.sqlite. So this is going to be used to track the to-dos that we're going to store in the database, and we're going to integrate our PyQt application with that database. Now what I'm going to do now that we have this file is I'm going to right click it, and we have an option here to open the database. I'm going to click that, and that brings a tab here called SQLite Explorer, and that has our SQLite database. Now if you want to do this, this is an extension that I've added to VS Code, and it's the VS Code SQLite extension. You can see that on this page here. I'll leave a link to that in the description as well. What we're going to do here is right click the database, and before we do that, actually let's have a look, and we can see that there's no tables at the moment in this database. We can actually run a query by going to the new query tab here, and we can input some SQL here in order to run a query. Now I'm just going to copy paste this to keep things quick, but what this is a create table statement. So we're creating a table called to-dos that has 3 columns, one for the ID, which is the primary key of the to-do in this SQLite table, and we have 2 other columns, one for the name of the to-do, and that's a varchar, and we also have a completed column, and that is the Boolean data type in SQLite. Now in order to actually execute this query, we can right click what we have here, and there's a run query option, and that's going to run that query. And you can see on the left hand side, if we refresh the database, we now have a table for our to-dos, and currently that will have no entries at the moment, but we have the 3 columns, so we now have this table we're going to work with for the rest of the video. Now we're going to start by defining a connection to this todos.sqlite database. So I'm going to close this tab here and go back to app.py, and what I'm going to do is go to the documentation that I had open here, and we're going to look at the QSQL database object. Now this is a class that handles a connection to the database, and it provides an interface for accessing a database through a connection, and an instance of the QSQL database that represents the connection. Now what I'm going to do is go back to VS Code, and we're going to write a function here, and I'm just going to do this above the app object, and that's going to be called open connection. Later on we're going to move this into its own module, but basically this is a function. It's not going to take any arguments, but it is going to return a Boolean value. Now I'm going to start with a comment here, an instance of QSQL database that represents the connection as it said in the documentation. So at the top here, from PyQt6, and we're going to reference the QtSql module this time, we're going to import that object. So we're going to import QSQL database. Once we have that, back in the open connection function, we can create a connection object by referencing the QSQL database, and there's a static function on that called add database. Now if we look at that function signature, it's got a type as the first parameter, and the type we're going to use here is QSQLite, and we have that in all capitals. Now to understand a bit more about this, let's go back to the documentation. As it says here, you can create a connection by calling the add database function, and actually there's varieties of these. And you specify the driver or the type of driver to use, and that depends on the database you're using. Is it SQLite or MySQL or PostgreSQL? And you can also provide a connection name as well as the type. Now in the example here, we have a DB object, and they are connecting to a Postgres database with this PSQL type. But we are obviously using SQLite, so we are using something different here, and that's QsqlLite. But if you want to know more about the types, you can click this link here to look at the types of drivers that are available. And we're using this one here for SQLite version 3, but we have ones for different databases that you can also connect to using PyQt. Now I'm going to go back to the documentation that we were on. And then what's happening here is you can set the database name, and you can also set the host name and things like that if you're using a remote database or something like PostgreSQL that's running on localhost. SQLite is just a file, so we need to provide the database name. Let's go back to VS Code, and we're going to do that now on the connection object. So set database name is the function we're interested in, and it's todos.sqlite. So all we're doing here is referencing the name of the database within our local directory. And then we can call a function on the connection object, and that's the con.open function. And we can check if that returns true or false. And basically we actually just want to indicate whether or not we've opened a connection. So what I'm going to do is just return the value of calling connection.open. If that's true, the connection has been opened, and then we can use these objects from the QtSql module in order to actually interact with the database. And if it returns false, we will know that there's been a problem with actually connecting to the database, and we're going to need to investigate that if it happens. So we're going to save this open connection function, and then what I'm going to do just below here, after we instantiate the application object, I'm just going to call that function. So let's print the open connection function here, and we're going to call that and see what we get back here. So that should be true or false based on whether or not the connection has been opened or not. What I'm going to do on the terminal is activate a Python virtual environment with PyQt installed. And I'm going to use the same one from the previous video, but if you need to do that, you can find some instructions in the description. So I'm now within that virtual environment, and we're going to run python app.py here, and we get back the true value from calling the open function. So when we call open connection, we're getting back true. And what that means is that when this function here is called, it is successfully establishing a connection to the database based on this object that we have. We've called the add database method to get back the connection and set the database name to the SQLite database. Let's now move on. Now, one thing I forgot to do here, if we go to the bottom, what we can do is actually take the Qsql database, and after we exit the function, or after we call open connection and get back true or false, we can call a close method on that, and that's going to close that connection to the database after we call open connection here. So all we're doing is checking we can establish a connection, and then we close that connection. What we're going to do now is move this function here to its own module. So basically, when we develop these larger PyQt applications, you might want to separate the code into different files. You don't want everything to be in your main file because it's going to be very hard to maintain that. So what we're going to do here is create another file, and I'm going to call this db.py. So the idea here is that this file is going to contain all of our database logic. So I'm going to move the open connection function into this, and we need to also import the Qsql database. So let's go back here and cut this out, and we're going to bring that into db.py. Once we've done that, we can import open connection here. So from our db module, we can import the open connection function, and we can remove it from this module. And now we are calling the open connection function down here, and we can remove the call to Qsql database.close. And in fact, instead of removing that, let's just go to the top and bring back the Qsql database object. All we've done here is basically move open connection into its own module. And don't worry, we're building this up and we're going to have a proper application soon. But to start with, we need to actually connect to the database. Now, what we're going to do next is set up a MainWindow object. And if you want to know more about that, check out the previous video on PyQt. Now, I'm going to keep the main window in the app.py file because it is the main window. But what we're going to do for now is just remove the call to open connection. And we're going to remove the call to the close function here. And just above the app object, what we're going to do is we're going to create a class here, and I'm going to call it MainWindow. And what we're going to inherit from is a widget from PyQt. So from the QtWidgets module, let's import the QMainWindow widget. And then we can use that, and we can create a subclass of that in our main window. And then we're going to provide a dunder init method for the constructor of this class. So to start with, we call the QMainWindow's init method. So that's the super.init call. And then after that, you can perform the setup you need. So I'm going to set a window title. And again, you can see more about that in the previous video. Set window title, and let's set that to do application. We can then create a central widget here. So I'm going to create a variable called central widget. And again, we're going to use a widget from PyQt's QtWidgets module. And that's the QWidget class here. So let's import that and instantiate it here. And what we're actually going to do here is create a central widget and layout. So we've got our widget and we now need a layout. And again, we're going to bring in another import here. And that's going to be QVBox layout at the top. and we're going to instantiate that within our _init method. So after we create the central widget, let's create a layout variable here, and that's going to be equal to a QVBox layout, and VBox refers to the vertical orientation, and we pass our widget in there. And we're going to add more widgets to this QVBox layout later in the video. We can then take our central widget and we're going to call the setLayout method, and that allows you to apply a layout to a widget, and we can pass that in here. So we're taking this QWidget object and we're setting the layout on that. And then the final thing we need to call here is the setCentralWidget method, and that's a method on a QMainWindow class. And as it says, it's going to set the central widget for this particular QMainWindow, and we can pass our central widget in here. Now once we've done that, below the class we can actually create the application object, and then we're going to add some more code here. So what we're going to do, and I'm going to paste a comment in here, we're going to open the connection before we create the windows. And that's important because later on the windows are going to fetch data from the database when they load up. So the database will need to be open for that. So let's open that connection. Remember, we imported the open connection function here. I'm going to copy that. We're going to use that down here. So let's do that just now. So again, we can check the Boolean value that's being returned from that. We're calling open connection, and if it returns false, what we want to do is simply exit the application. So we can use system.exit for that. After we've done that, we can create a window object here by instantiating the MainWindow class that we created, and then all widgets are hidden by default in PyQt, so we can call the window.show function in order to actually show that window. And I'm actually going to remove the call to sys.exit, and we're just going to run app.exec at the bottom. So let's test that out. We're going to run Python, and it's going to be app.py, and we're going to see what happens. We see the window on the screen, and also in the background the database has been opened, and we can close that off. Now I want to create a widget for actually creating a to-do in this application. This is where we're actually going to start building up the user interface for this PyQt application. Now I don't want to do all of the widgets in this app.py file, so we're going to split this out into modules as well. Let's create a module here called create_todo.py, and we're going to have a form in this module that's going to allow us to actually add a new to-do to the database. Now what I'm going to do in this file is bring in a lot of imports from the QtWidgets module. So we're importing QWidget and QVBox layout. The reason is we're going to create a form here, and we want the form fields to be vertically stacked. So we're going to do that in a QVBox layout. We're also going to add a QLineEdit, which is going to allow the user to enter data into an input field. That's another widget, and we have labels for the form field labels as well. We're also going to have a checkbox, and that's because we have that Boolean completed flag on the to-do table. And that's going to be a yes or no thing, and we're going to use the checkbox for that. And we have a button that's going to allow us to submit the form itself. And finally, a message box that's going to display a message to the user when certain actions occur. So we've got all of that imported. We're going to create a class now called ToDoForm, and that's going to inherit from the QWidget class that we've imported from the QWidgets module. So we need quite a few widgets here. We've imported them all. We're going to create a _init method, and we're going to call the QWidgets init method by calling super.init. And let's now create a layout object by instantiating the QVBox layout, and we're going to add some widgets to this layout. So we want the form to contain a name input for the actual name of the to-do. So what we're going to do here is cache that on the class with self.nameLabel, and we're going to set that equal to QLabel. Now this label, we want text to appear in that, and we're going to have the text to-do name here, and then we can add that to the layout. So I'm going to copy the name of the layout here, and that has a method called addWidget. So you can add widgets to the layout class, and we're going to add self.nameLabel. So that's the QLabel instance. We've added that, and then that's going to appear at the top of the form because it's a vertical layout. Below that, we want to also create the actual field where the user can enter the name of the to-do. So we can do that with another field here, and that's going to be name input. We're going to create a variable called name input on the class, or I should say on the instance, and that's going to be an instance of a QLineEdit object. And the parent here is just going to be self. And we're going to copy this call to add widget because we also need to add our new name input to the widget. So we're stacking these up vertically, as we're going to see in a second. So as well as the name of the to-do, remember from the SQL table, we also have a completed checkbox. So we're going to add a widget for that. And like before, we need a label for this widget. So what we're going to do is paste these in here, and I'm going to change the name of these. So rather than a name label, it's going to be completed label. And that's what we want to add to the layout as well. And the label for this should be mark as completed. And in fact, let's just simplify this. We're going to add completed as the label. Now, once we've got the label, we can then create the checkbox itself. So we're going to create a field here called completed checkbox, completed_checkbox. And that's going to be an instance of a QCheckbox object. And again, we're going to copy layout.addWidget here, and we're going to paste that in here. And what we're actually adding this time is the completed checkbox. So that's going to be added to that vertical layout. And then once we've got the name and the completed boxes, we're going to add a submit button here. So again, self.submit button, that's going to be on the instance of this class, and that's going to be a QPushButton object. And to that, I want to add some text of submit, and again, the parent of self here. The text is just what appears in the actual button itself. It's going to say text, and then the parent is going to be the actual instance of the class. Now what I also want to do is when the button, or rather when the form is submitted, I want to hook that up to a method that's going to perform an action when we submit the new to-do. So let's take that submit button, self.submit button, and what we're going to do is on the clicked event, and remember the last video we had signals and slots in PyQt. This here is the signal, it's the click signal, basically an event that happens on the button, and then we can connect that up to a method. So I'm going to create a method here called self.submitToDo, and that's going to be a method on this class that we're going to create at the bottom here. So let's do that just now, and as it's a method, it's going to take self as a parameter. And for now, we're just going to print submitting here, and we're going to change this method a bit later in the video. And I'm going to remove the uppercase U. Now finally, I want to add the button to the layout. So again, layout.addWidget, and let's add the submit button to this. And the last thing we need to do is actually set the layout here. So we're going to set the layout, and we can do that on the QWidget class by calling self.setLayout. And we're going to set that to the layout that we've got in the dunder init method. So let me very quickly go over this. What we're doing in the dunder init method is we create a VBox for vertical layouts. And then we're creating some labels for the form fields that we're going to add for the name and for the completed checkbox. And the name field, that's a QLineEdit, as we're going to see in a second. And the completed checkbox is a QCheckboxWidget. And finally, we have the submit button, and we're connecting that up to a method on the class that's going to be called when we actually submit the form. So let's now save this, and we're going to start this up in a second. But first of all, let's go back to app.py, and we're going to copy the name of this, the to-do form. And in app.py, we're going to import this at the top. So let me just quickly remove this. I don't think we need it. And what we're going to do at the top here is from the create to-do module, we're going to import that class. And we're going to see this to-do form in a second. So let's go to dunder init, and we're actually going to instantiate that. So after we create the layout, what we're going to do here in this class is we're actually going to instantiate the to-do form. So self.to-do form, let's create a variable on the instance, and we're going to instantiate our to-do form, which remember is a subclass of QWidget, which means we can use layout.addWidget, and we can actually add self.to-do form to our layout. So that's a custom class that we're instantiating, that we've created, and we're subclassing QWidget. But because we're subclassing QWidget, what we can actually do is just use the addWidget method on the layout and actually add an instance of the class to our layout. Now let's actually run the application and see if we can see anything. So I'm going to run python app.py, and let's see what comes up here. We can actually see this. We have a to-do application. Let me make this a bit bigger here. Not too big because it messes up the layout a bit. And you can constrain the layout using utilities from PyQt. But we can enter a to-do name in here, and we can mark it as completed or not. And then we can submit this. And when we submit it, notice on the terminal that that print statement is being executed. So if we go back to create to-do and we look at the button that we have here, on the click signal, we're connecting that to the slot called self.submitToDo, and that calls this method at the bottom. So later on, what we're going to do, very soon actually, is we're going to change this method here so that when the to-do is actually submitted, it's actually going to add that to the database. That's a little bit later, but what I want to do now is just below the form, I want to add a list or a table, let's say, of to-dos. And that table is going to be populated with the to-dos that are actually in the database. And then when we click submit here and add a new to-do, we want that new one to be added to the table. So let's get started with that now. What I'm going to do is close this, and I'm going to create a new file here at the left-hand side, and that's going to be called todotable.py. And that's going to be quite similar to what we have in this file here, where we're subclassing QWidget, and we're creating a dunder init method, and we're going to create some utilities within our table. So what I'm going to do is just copy the class, and we're going to bring that into todotable.py, and I'm going to change the name of the class. It's going to be todotable. And at the top here, we're going to import some widgets from PyQt. So the QWidget is going to be what we're subclassing, and we have QVBoxLayout as well. And again, we want to create a vertical layout here. And importantly, this one here for our table, that's the QTableWidget. So within the TodoTable's dunder init method, let's again create a layout here by instantiating the VBoxLayout. And then we're going to create the table widget. So I'm going to add a comment here. So for the table widget, we'll create a variable called self.todo_table. And that's going to be an instance of the QTableWidget. Now the to-do table here has some methods that we can call to set up the table the way we want it. So for example, we can set the column count. And because we have 2 columns, let's say, or 2 fields on the SQL table, one for the name of the to-do and one for whether or not it's completed, I'm going to set 2 columns here. And we can also set the headers for each of these columns. So self.todo_table, and there's a method called setHorizontalHeaderLabels, this one here. And we can pass a Python list into that with the labels. So to-do name is going to be for the first column, and I think the second column, let's just say completed with a question mark. And once we've done that, we can actually add the to-do table widget. So self.todo_table, we can add that to the layout here. So I'm going to again call the method we've seen many times now, and that's layout.addWidget. And we're passing self.todo_table into that. And then finally, as we did in the other class, we can use the self.setLayout method in order to set the layout for this class. So this is a very simple QWidget subclass that creates a vertical layout and has a QTableWidget that we're adding to that. We can now save this and go back to our app.py file. And at the top here, we're going to import this new widget. And that's going to be from the to-do table module. So let's import that class now. And that was called to-do table. Now, like we did before within the dunder init method, after we've added the to-do form to the layout, we're going to now create the actual table. So self.todo_table. Let's instantiate the to-do table. And again, we'll copy the add widget method here, and we're going to pass the table into that. I think I've named that incorrectly, so it should be to-do_table. So I'm going to fix that up just now. It's going to be called to-do table, and we can add that to the widget. Now let's once again run the application, Python app.py, and we're going to see now we have this table that appears below the form. Now we need to populate the table with the records that are in the database. At the moment we don't have anything in the database though, so we're going to see an empty table by default anyway. So what we're going to start with is adding the new to-dos to the database table. So the form at the top, we want to actually hook up the logic for that to start with. So what we're going to do is go back to our create to-do widget. And what we're going to do is go down to the submit handler or the slot that we've set up here. And we're going to remove the print statement for now. And we're going to get access to the input values that the user has submitted. We can do that because on the init method here, in the dunder init method, we have our name input, and we can reference that and get the text that the user has entered by calling the .text method. And we can do the same for the completed input. So self.completed checkbox, we can get the isChecked method on that, and that's a method exclusive to checkboxes, I think. So you can determine whether or not the checkbox is checked by calling this method. And then we can check if we have a name. So if the user has actually submitted a name here, what we're going to do then is we're going to actually save this data into the database for the name and for the completed values. Now, in order to do that, I'm going to go back to the PyQt documentation for the QtSql module. And we're going to use the QSQL query class. This provides a means of executing and manipulating SQL statements. So you can create, you can navigate, and you can retrieve data from SQL queries that are executed on the QSQL database object that we've already set up. And this includes data manipulation statements like selects and inserts and so on, and also data definition statements such as create table and so on. Now we need to import this. So what I'm going to do is go back to VS Code, and at the top of our to-do form page, we're going to bring in an import here. So from PyQt, and that's PyQt6 here, and we're going to reference again the QtSql module. From there, let's import the QSQL query object, this one here, and that's going to allow us to perform the query inside this if statement. So we can set up a query variable here by instantiating a QSQL query, and then we can create a prepared statement with the query.prepare method. And it's inside here that we can actually add the text for our SQL query. And what we're going to do is we're going to insert into the to-dos table that we had. And we don't need to worry about the ID because that's a primary key. It will be automatically assigned by the database. But we are going to insert the name and the completed values. And we need to add those values in here. And I'm going to add these placeholders with question marks because this is a prepared statement. And we will actually bind the values that we have on line 42 and 43 after we prepare the statement. So these are just placeholders, and this is to prevent things like SQL injection. What we can do after we've prepared the statement is we can actually bind the values with the add bind value variable. So first of all, we're going to bind the name value, and I'm going to copy that to the line below, and we're also going to bind the completed value. Now after we've done that, we can call query.exec to actually execute the SQL query, and that's going to hopefully insert a new to-do into the database. Once we've done that, we want to inform the user, so we can add a success message, and we can use the q_message box, which was a widget that we imported at the top here. We've not used it yet, but we did import it near the start of the video, and that has a method called information. So if you want to display information in a message box, you can use this here. So the parent's going to be self, and then the title of the message box, let's just say success for that. And finally, we have a third parameter that we can add here, and that's the text inside the message box. So I'm going to paste some text in here, and it's just going to say to do saved successfully. And what we can also do is we can refer to self.nameInput, and we can clear the value of that. So let's do that just now. Self.nameInput, and that has a method called clear. And we can also do something similar for our completed checkbox. So let's get a reference to that here. And underneath this one here, self.completed checkbox, and then we can set checked to false. That should be set checked. We're going to set that to false. And in Python, false has a capital. Now, if we don't have a valid name, what we can do here is create an else block, and that should be at this level of indentation. So basically, if there is no name, that means the user has not entered any text into the name field in that form. So what we can then do is just use QMessageBox again. And this time we can call the .warning method on that. And again, self will be the parent. And we can give that a title of validation error. And for the text parameter, let's say, please enter a name for the to-do. Now I actually want to test this out now, so let's bring back the terminal, and to do that I need to actually close the existing application, and what we're going to do now is rerun python app.py, and this time we're going to try and actually submit a to-do. So let's create a to-do here called learn Python, and let's say that's not completed. We're going to click submit, and you can see that we get the message box there telling us that the to-do has been saved successfully. So let's click OK to that. And what I actually want to do is check the SQLite database and see if we have the to-do being stored in the table. So I'm going to open the database again in that extension, and let's go to the to-dos table. And if we click this show table button, you can see on the table at the right hand side here that we have actually got our item learn Python in there, and completed is set to 0, which is going to translate to false in this database. So that actually has worked. We've now got our slot method here, and it's using this prepared statement to actually insert SQL into the database, into that to-dos table, based on the values that have been entered by the user. Now, one problem that we have if we go back to the application is that we don't update the table that you can see here below. So we've added a new to-do, but it's not appeared in the table below. So we're going to have to do that as well. Now, in order to do that, we're going to pass something into our to-do form widget that we have here. So the self parameter is for the _init method, but we want to actually pass another item in here, and that's going to be a callback. So I'm going to call this onSubmitCallback, and we're going to define this in the parent that's instantiating the to-do form. And what we're going to do within the _init method is we're going to set a reference to that on the class. So self.onSubmitCallback is going to be equal to what we pass in here as a parameter. Now, once we've done that, let's go back to the parent, and that's in app.py. So in app.py, we have our main window, and we're instantiating our form class here. And what we're going to do now is pass something into that. So I'm going to pass in a method, and that's going to be called self.addToDo_list. So that's going to be a method that we're going to pass in there, and we need to actually define this on our QMainWindow class. So let's create a method on the class addToDo_list, and what we're going to pass into this method is the name and the completed values. So this is a method, and we're going to pass this method down into our to-do form widget, and we're only going to pass down a reference to this method. And that means that the child, which is the to-do form, is going to be able to call this and pass the name and the completed values up to this method. So let's go back to here and define the actual body of the method. And what this is going to be is a callback to add the to-do item to the list. So, or I should say the table here. So let me change that. It's going to add it to the table. And what we're going to pass in is a method that's actually on the to-do table. So again, we're creating another method here, but we'll tie this all up in a second, so just bear with me. So the to-do table is on the class, and that's the list itself, the table. And we're going to define a method on that called addToDoItem, and that's going to add the to-do item to the table. And again, that's going to take the name of the item and the completed value in as a parameter. So let's now define this addToDoItem method. If we go to toDoTable.py and we go back down to the bottom here underneath the _init method, we can define an addToDoItem method that's going to take those values, so the name of the to-do that we want to add, and also the completed value. Now I'm just going to print adding at the moment, and we're going to define this at the end. So let me just go back to our parent method or our parent widget here. It's app.py. So we're calling add to do item, and that's going to be called in this add to do to list method. So what we need to do now is go back to create to do.py, and we've taken this callback method in as part of the dunder init method, and we're storing that on the class. So what we need to do now is take self.onSubmitCallback, and if we go down to our submit to do method here, what we're going to do is go down to the if statement, and here we are executing the SQL query to insert the new to do into the table. Now this exec method, if we look at that, returns a Boolean value, whether the query was executed successfully or not. So what I'm going to do is just store that in a value or a variable called OK, and then we can check if OK is equal to true. And in that case, what we're going to do is actually call self.onSubmitCallback, and we're going to pass up the name and the completed value. So remember, this has been passed down from app.py. This is the method that we want to call when we actually have a new to-do being inserted. And we can actually tab all of these over as well. We only want to display the success information message if the OK value is true as well, and then we can clear these out. Now don't worry, I'm going to go over all this process at the end just one more time so that we understand it. But let's just test that it still works at the moment. So I'm going to close the application, and then we're going to rerun app.py here. So python app.py, and let me insert a new to do. So let's say learn Go, and we're going to check this off as completed. And when we submit that, you can see the adding message appearing at the bottom. And that means that this method here on our to do table has been called, and we are passing in the name and the completed values into that method. So the last thing we need to do here is we need to actually add the item to the table that you can see here on this page. Now, in order to do that, we're going to reference another object from PyQt. So let's go back to the documentation, and what we're going to search for is the QTableWidget item. So let's go to this page here, and this class provides an item for use with the QTableWidget class, and table items are used to hold pieces of information for table widgets. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use this in the method that we have on the to-do table, and again we'll come back to this at the end and we'll summarize everything, but we're going to import the QTableWidget item from the QtWidgets module, and then if we go down to this method here, I'm going to remove the print statement. Now what we're going to do here is we're going to determine the current row count in this method, and we're then going to insert the new row. So what I'm going to do to start with is get a variable called row position, and we can call self.toDoTable, and that gives us the table widget, and that has a method called row count. That will give us the existing row count for this table, and then we can insert a row at that position. So self.toDoTable, and that has another method we're going to use called insert row, and we can insert the row at this position here that we've got on line 20. So we've inserted a new row into the table. What we're going to do now is we're going to add the to-do's name into the first column of this row. So to do that, we can again get a reference to to-do table, and we're going to call the setItem method on that, and it's going to be at the given row that we have in row position here, and the column is going to be column 0, and that's because the name that we're going to add here is going to be in the first column of this table. And then what we can do is use QTableWidget item, and we're going to pass in the name that we got as a parameter, as an argument to this method. So in other words, we've created a new row into the table that we have on this widget, and then we're setting the first column of that particular row to have this name, and we pass the name into the QTableWidget item. And we can do something quite similar for the completed status. So what I'm going to do is go to the line below, and I'm actually going to create a Python statement here. So the status is going to be equal to completed, and that is if the completed value that we're passing in is which is a Boolean, remember, if that evaluates to true, we'll say completed. Otherwise, we can say, let's just say pending for now. And I'm going to copy this line of code for setting the item, and we're going to bring that to the line below, and we can pass the status into the QTableWidget item. That's what's actually going to be displayed in the column, and we'll change the column number from column 0 to column 1, and that's going to show the status here in the second column in the table. So I hope that makes sense. Let's test this out. So I'm going to close the existing application, and let's clear the terminal just now, and we're going to run python app.py, and again let's create another to do here. So I'm going to say, let's say learning Java, and we'll say that that is completed, and we're going to submit this. And you can see that when that's submitted, it's added the new row to the table. And let's do this again. So if we wanted to learn Haskell, we can submit this, and we get the message box as before, and we're getting that that's been added to the table below. So we can now submit to-dos, and they're added to the table, and that's working fine. There is one thing we need to do here in order to get this working properly. Notice that the existing to-dos are not being loaded into the table when the application is first loading up. So we need to actually create, or rather we need to fetch the to-dos from the database when we first start the application. That's what we're going to do now. So let's close this at the moment, and we'll see how to populate the table with these existing to-do items when the app loads. Now we're going to go to the table component. So let me just minimize the Explorer here, and we're going to go to QtSql, and we're already in there actually. So what we're going to do is target the dunder init method, and we're going to load these to-dos in the dunder init method. Now at the bottom of that, we're setting the layout here, and what we can do after that is call a method that I'm going to define in a second called getTodos. So that's the method, and let's define that just now, and that's going to take self as a parameter because it's a method on an object. And again, we're going to create a query here by instantiating the QSQL query object, which we need to import. So let's copy the imports from create_todo.py. It was the QSQL query import, and we're going to bring that to the top of this file here. Once we've imported that, we can go back to the method. So when we have a query object, what we can do is we can execute some SQL with the query.exec function. And this is a selection, so we don't need to worry about SQL injection here. What we're going to get is the name and the completed columns, and that's from the to-dos table in the SQLite database. And then we can iterate over the results, and the query object has a function called .next that will give you the next row in the result set. So while we have a valid next row, we can use a while statement here for that. What we're going to do is we're going to get a count of the rows that are in the table at the moment. So self.todotable.rowCount, and the first time that the while loop executes, that's going to be equal to 0, because when we load the application, the table does not contain any rows, but every time we iterate over this while loop, it's going to add 1 to the row count because we're going to insert a new row into the table. So let's actually insert the new row. So again, self.todotable, and we're going to call set row count. We already saw set column count in the previous example. And we're going to set the row count to whatever we got on line 27 when we got the row count, and we're going to add 1 to that. And that's going to give us a new row in the table. And then what we can do, again, referencing self.todotable, is we can call that setItem method. And the row number is going to be equal to rows here, and the column number is going to be equal to 0. And we're going to use the QTableWidget item to actually add a value into that position. And what we want to do is we want to get the name out of the SQL result for this given row. So what we can do in order to do that is use query.value, and the number of the actual value we want is 0 because that was the first one of these two statements here, these two columns. So we're going to add that, we're going to get that value from the query result, and we're going to add that to the table at that position. And we can copy that line down to the line below, and we're going to do something similar for the same row but on the second column. So we add 1 as the second parameter. And this time we're going to get the second result from the SQL selection, and that will give us back the completed value. And then what we're going to do here is we're actually going to just convert that to a string, because remember it's a Boolean value by default, and we can only insert strings into this table. So let's do that just now, and what we're going to do to finish this is actually run the application and see how that looks. So let me clear the terminal and actually just rerun app.py, and you can see that now when the application loads, we have the existing database records in the table by default. Now we had a different format for the completed column when we added a new to-do. Instead of 0 and 1, it said completed and pending. So we're going to do some conversion of what we're getting out of the query here. So let me change this a little bit. So let's take query.value here, and we're going to cut that out, and we're going to store it in a value called completed. Query.value1 will give us the Boolean value of true or false. And then I'm going to copy the status line that we had down here. So let's copy this, and we'll bring that back into this method here. So status is going to be completed if the Boolean value is true, otherwise it's going to be pending. And now we can actually just put the status in here where we are calling QTableWidget item. So we're passing the status in there, and let's now try this again. I'm going to close the application here, and we can rerun app.py, and this time we get the correct representation. So if it's not completed, we have pending, and if it's completed, we get the text message completed here, rather than just seeing zeros and ones. And let's test that when we add a to-do, that is still working. So we're going to add another to-do here. And what's a programming language I've not used? Let's say PHP. And let's say we have learned that, we've completed that to-do. When we click submit, we get our message box, and you can see Learn PHP has appeared at the bottom of the list. And if we close this off and started the application again, you can see that that is there by default now. And the reason for this, if we go over things one more time, is that when we are initializing our to-do table, we are now calling this method at the bottom called getTodos. And that getTodos method is executing an SQL statement to get the name and the completed values from the to-dos table. And then we are iterating over the result set. We're getting the number of rows in the table at a given time, and we're setting the row count to that number plus 1. And then we're adding these items into the table using the setItem method on the to-do widget, or rather on the table widget. And that's going to be all for this video in terms of the code. So what I'm going to do is just go and summarize what we're doing here, starting at app.py. So in app.py, we build a MainWindow object, and we do that by subclassing QMainWindow, and we're setting some titles and stuff here and also some layouts. But importantly, what we're doing is we have two custom widgets, and we've created classes for these by subclassing the QWidget class. First of all, we have a to-do form, and that's what appears at the top of the page here. And we're passing a callback method into that that's going to be used in that form. And we're also instantiating a to-do table widget, and we're adding these two widgets to our layout and setting that layout on our central widget using the setLayout method. And finally, we set the central widget to that central widget. Now, I want to go over the to-do form to begin with. We're passing this method in here called addToDo_to_list. So when the to-do form is submitted, we want this callback method to be called. And the reason we're passing that in is because we need to update the to-do table. So the to-do table is on the parent as well. We need to do this from the parent, so we pass the method in. And if we look at the method here, addToDo_to_list, what this does is when you call this, you pass in the name of the new to-do and whether or not that new to-do was completed. And then that in turn is going to call a method called addToDoItem, and that's on the table component, the table widget. And we then just pass the values into that method. Now, if we go to createTodo.py, this is where our to-do form is defined. We accept that callback function and we store it on the instance. And then when the actual to-do form is submitted, this is the signal, or rather this is the slot method that's called. And inside this method, we get the name and the completed values that have been added from the form. And we are then inserting them into the database using the QtSql query and using the prepare function. And if that query is executed successfully, what we do is we then call the callback method that's been passed into this class, and we pass through the name and completed values to that callback method. And that's going to allow us to then update the table from the form, even though they are not related, they are just related through a parent object. So we pass the callbacks in from the parent, and that allows them to perform actions when something happens in the other component. Now, if we go back to to-do table, let's look at this one here. And when we actually add a to-do item, this is ultimately what's called when the form is submitted. So what we do is we get the row count and we're inserting a new row at that position. So that's going to add a new row to the database. And then we're going to set the name and the completed status on that new row. So when we submit the form and we add a new to-do, it's going to add it to the database, but it's also going to add it to the table here, as you can see. So we've shown how to use PyQt6 with a relational database with an SQL-based database in this video. And you could very easily extend this example to add new functionality as well. For example, you could have a button to delete a given to-do from the table and from the underlying database. So there's plenty of options to extend this. What I'm going to do is push this code to GitHub. So it will be available on GitHub, and I'll leave a link to that in the description of the video. And if this content's been useful and you want to support the channel, we have a Ko-fi link in the description as well. Thank you very much to everyone who has contributed to that. It's much appreciated. And if you want to support the channel, also don't forget to give the video a thumbs up. And if you're interested in more PyQt6 videos or anything similar, let me know in the comments as well. I'm happy to consider making more videos on these topics. But we're going to leave it here for now. That's been quite a lot in this video, so thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.